We created two AI characters, an advocate defending EVs as the future of mobility, and a skeptic arguing that EVs are an overhyped trend. We put these two characters face to face in a debate. For added engagement, we used 5 AI models as judges to rate the arguments from both sides. Play fair. No skipping ahead to see the results. The debate begins now with this question: are electric vehicles the future of mobility or just another overhyped idea?
Before anything else, let's be clear. Electric vehicles are often touted as the inevitable future, but I contend they are overhyped. First, the cost barrier remains significant. EVs typically carry higher sticker prices than comparable gasoline models, and government incentives can't hide that reality. Second, charging infrastructure is still woefully underdeveloped outside major urban centers. Long road trips become logistical nightmares when you have to plan around scarce fast charging stations and unpredictable wait times. Third, battery production relies on mining rare earth metals, often in environmentally and socially questionable ways, undercutting the green narrative. Fourth, battery degradation over time means replacement costs that can rival the value of the vehicle itself. Fifth, electricity generation still depends heavily on fossil fuels. Charging an EV in many regions simply shifts emissions to the power plant rather than eliminating them. Finally, the raw materials required for mass EV adoption, lithium, cobalt, nickel, are in increasingly limited supply, creating geopolitical and supply chain vulnerabilities. Taken together, these factors suggest EVs are a fashionable trend, not a practical, sustainable solution for most consumers today.
Each AI judge will now score the argument from 0 to 10 based on their own criteria. The average score will be added to each debater's total points. This argument received an average score of 8.5.
While it's true EVs face challenges today, they represent the most viable path toward cleaner, smarter mobility. First, total cost of ownership for EVs is already competitive and often lower than gas cars once you factor in far lower fuel and maintenance expenses. Electric drivetrains have fewer moving parts, translating to fewer service visits and longer-lasting components. Second, charging infrastructure is expanding at unprecedented rates. Public and private investment is pouring into fast-charging networks, and advanced mapping apps make trip planning simpler than ever. Third, battery chemistry is evolving quickly. Manufacturers are reducing reliance on problematic materials, improving energy density, and designing modules that enable efficient recycling, meaning the environmental footprint of battery production will shrink over time. Fourth, as grids become greener, thanks to solar, wind, and other renewables, charging EVs increasingly displaces fossil fuels rather than shifting emissions elsewhere. Fifth, major automakers are committing billions to electrification, signaling that supply chain scaling will drive down sticker prices within a few years. Finally, cities worldwide are adopting zero-emission mandates, inspiring innovation in vehicle-to-grid integration and smart mobility solutions. In sum, though EVs aren't perfect today, they are the only technology poised to decarbonize personal transportation at scale and build a sustainable future.
While you assert that total cost of ownership, TCO, already favors EVs, that claim often hinges on optimistic assumptions. First, electricity prices vary widely. Residential rates in many regions spike during peak hours, eroding any fuel cost savings. Second, maintenance may be simpler, but costly repairs like replacing a degraded battery pack can easily offset those savings, especially once initial warranties expire. Third, although you highlight rapid infrastructure growth, new charging stations still face permitting delays, grid connection bottlenecks, and supply shortages. These factors mean many rural or suburban areas remain underserved. Fourth, your point about grids getting greener overlooks the reality that in large swaths of the US and globally, coal and natural gas still dominate power generation. Charging an EV there often emits as much CO2 per mile as a fuel-efficient gasoline car. Finally, automaker commitments and city mandates may drive future change, but today's deployment timeline remains slow, and consumers can't rely on speculative policies and investments that may be delayed or rolled back. Adopting EVs broadly under current conditions therefore seems premature.
Your points about costs and infrastructure are valid concerns today, but they don't withstand a closer look. Firstly, while electricity rates vary, many utilities now offer off-peak or time-of-use plans that slash charging costs by up to 50% versus daytime rates, meaning typical EV owners pay significantly less per mile than drivers relying on gasoline. Secondly, modern battery packs come with 8 to 10-year warranties and retain 70 to 80% capacity well past 100,000 miles. Even if replacement is expensive, most owners sell EVs long before full battery replacement is needed, and resale values remain strong. Third, though permitting can be slow in some jurisdictions, Private networks, Tesla, superchargers, Electrify America, plus aggressive public funding are bringing thousands of fast chargers online annually. Rural congestion is already easing. Fourth, while grids aren't perfect, the U.S. average grid CO2 intensity is now below that of a gasoline sedan. Studies show even in coal-heavy regions, EVs emit less CO2 per mile. Finally, automaker and municipal commitments aren't speculative. They're backed by billions in signed contracts and legislation. In short, the cost and infrastructure arguments hold less weight when viewed in the context of real-world programs and rapid momentum.
Your emphasis on time-of-use charging plans overlooks that not all households have access to such tariffs. Renters or apartment dwellers often cannot install home chargers. Public fast charging networks, though expanding, frequently suffer from reliability issues. Broken chargers, long wait times, and high idle fees deter adoption. Battery warranties can mask steep degradation. Many owners report noticeable range loss within 5 years, and warranty coverage seldom guarantees full replacement, only prorated refunds. Moreover, resale values are volatile. As new models with superior range enter the market, older EVs depreciate rapidly. Regarding grid emissions, analyses often rely on national averages, ignoring local pockets where coal remains dominant. Charging in such regions can be as carbon-intensive as driving a hybrid. Finally, while legislation supports EVs now, political shifts could curtail subsidies or freeze new infrastructure projects, leaving consumers exposed to stranded assets. Taken together, these realities suggest EV adoption still faces fundamental barriers.
It's true not every home can host a charger today, but multifamily dwellings are rapidly adding shared and curbside solutions. Utility programs and managed charging services enable renters to access off-peak rates through communal stations. Public networks also track uptime in real time. Major operators now boast uptime above 95%, and idle fees actually encourage turnover, reducing wait times. Battery degradation is often overstated. Most modern cells lose only 5 to 10% capacity over 5 years, and warranty terms typically provide full replacements or high-value credits, not just prorated refunds. As for resale, growing consumer interest and certified pre-owned EV programs stabilize used prices. Benchmark data shows depreciation for popular models is converging with ICE vehicles. While coal still powers some grids, utility-scale renewables and local green tariffs allow owners to choose cleaner electrons. Even in coal-dependent regions, per-mile emissions for EVs remain lower than hybrids. Finally, EV support transcends party lines. Automakers, utilities, and municipalities have locked in long-term investments, making significant rollbacks unlikely.
You point to evolving battery chemistry and recycling, but the reality is raw material scarcity remains a critical bottleneck. Global lithium and cobalt production has struggled to keep pace with demand. Prices have surged over 50% in the last 2 years alone, driving up battery and vehicle costs again. Mining for these elements often occurs in water-stressed regions like the Atacama Desert, exacerbating local shortages and ecological damage. In addition, artisanal cobalt mining in the DRC raises serious human rights concerns that even high-tech recycling can't immediately solve. On the grid side, your optimistic view of greener electrons glosses over the fact that many distribution networks weren't designed for millions of EVs charging simultaneously. Without massive infrastructure upgrades, transformer replacements, substation reinforcements, strategic charging plans could still trigger brownouts or force utilities to raise rates for all customers. In sum, until supply chains stabilize and grids are robustly modernized, widespread EV adoption risks inflating costs and shifting burdens onto communities rather than delivering the clean, affordable mobility you describe.
Raw material challenges are real, but industry responses are rapidly reducing reliance on scarce inputs. Major automakers are shifting to lithium iron phosphate, LFP, chemistries that eliminate cobalt entirely and use abundant, less water-intensive resources. New lithium extraction methods like direct brine processing cut water usage by up to 60% and planned mining projects in non-arid regions are poised to boost output significantly over the next 5 years. Meanwhile, scalable closed-loop recycling programs recover over 90% of key battery elements, slashing the need for virgin mining. Regarding human rights issues, top brands now require traceability audits and ethically sourced cobalt only from audited suppliers. On the grid front, smart charging software and utility demand response programs are already smoothing peak loads. Real-world pilots have shown V2G load balancing can reduce local transformer stress by 30. Regulators are funding targeted upgrades, transformer retrofits, and substation reinforcements so that even high EV growth can be absorbed without brownouts or rate hikes. Thus, supply chain scaling and grid modernization are on track to support mass EV deployment sustainably.
Even if charging networks expand, the fundamental inconvenience of recharging versus refueling remains a major hurdle. A full fast charge still takes 20 to 30 minutes under ideal conditions, compared to 5 minutes at a gas pump, time many drivers aren't willing to sacrifice on long trips or during tight schedules. Residential charging relies on users remembering to plug in nightly. A forgotten charging session can strand drivers without warning, whereas gasoline stations are ubiquitous and quickly accessible. Beyond convenience, the cradle-to-grave environmental impact of EVs often looks worse than advertised. Manufacturing an EV typically emits up to 70% more CO2 than producing a comparable internal combustion vehicle due to battery production. And many studies show that it takes over 50,000 miles of driving before a mid-sized EV breaks even on lifecycle emissions compared to an efficient gasoline car. Until charging becomes as seamless as filling a tank and upfront manufacturing emissions fall dramatically, consumer adoption and genuine environmental benefits will remain limited.
It's true that fast charging takes longer than a quick fill-up, but real-world behavior mitigates much of that inconvenience. Many drivers top off during routine breaks, lunch, shopping, or rest stops, so charging time overlaps with other activities. Next-generation chargers are reaching 350 kilowatt, cutting 10 to 80% charge times to under 20 minutes even on large packs. Paired with amenities like cafes or restrooms, this window becomes productive rather than dead time. At home, smart charging reminders and automation make overnight charging as habitual as plugging in a laptop. Forgetfulness is rare once a home station is installed, and public Level 2 ports fill gaps for those without private driveways. On lifecycle emissions, recent studies show new battery factories using renewable energy reduce production CO2 by 40, bringing the break-even point down to around 20,000 miles. Far lower than most EVs cover in a few years. As grids decarbonize further, that environmental payback improves, making EVs cleaner long before 50,000 miles.
You highlight faster charging and cleaner manufacturing, but EVs still struggle in extreme climates and secondary market viability. First, lithium-ion batteries can lose 20 to 30% of their range in cold weather, forcing drivers to reduce speed or avoid long trips when temperatures drop, an inconvenience ICE vehicles don't face. Second, many regions lack reliable winter maintenance for public chargers like snow clearance and heated connectors, so cold climate drivers risk frequent station outages. Third, second life battery programs remain untested at scale. Grid storage pilots have shown mixed results around capacity fade and safety concerns, meaning recycling infrastructure isn't yet mature enough to handle millions of retired packs without environmental leakage. Fourth, the upfront cost of EVs still places them out of reach for lower-income families. And even if long-term TCO is favorable, financing hurdles and down payment requirements limit adoption. Finally, adding millions of EVs increases demand for peak-hour electricity, often prompting utilities to build new natural gas peaker plants, which undermines long-term decarbonization goals. Until these real-world constraints are fully addressed, broad EV adoption remains impractical for many consumers.
Cold weather performance has improved dramatically. Modern EVs use active thermal management to keep batteries at optimal temperatures, reducing range loss to under 10%, even in sub-zero conditions. Many manufacturers preheat batteries en route, minimizing performance hits. Charging networks in cold regions now incorporate winterization measures, heated plugs, weatherproof enclosures, and enhanced snow clearing protocols to ensure reliability. Second life batteries are already powering megawatt-scale grid projects. Standardized modules and strict safety certifications ensure retired packs are handled responsibly, and new recycling facilities will scale up as more volumes arrive. On affordability, down payment programs, income-based incentives, and expanding used EV markets have made models accessible to lower-income families. Leasing options further lower upfront costs. Finally, smart charging and vehicle-to-grid integration allow EVs to discharge during peak demand, smoothing load and often avoiding the need for new peaker plants. These innovations mean EVs are well on track to overcome real-world constraints and deliver broad, equitable adoption.
Your assurances about winterization and second life reuse are encouraging, but several gaps remain. First, even with thermal management, cold climate range still falls sharply for lower trim models without premium battery packs, leaving budget buyers more exposed to performance losses. Second, while pilot projects repurpose retired batteries, the sheer volume of EVs retiring over the next decade will likely outpace recycling and repurposing infrastructure, risking stockpiles that degrade in landfills and generate toxic runoff. Third, income-based incentives and leases help some households, but financing terms for subprime borrowers carry steep interest rates. Combined with insurance premiums that rise on EVs, lower-income buyers can see TCO spike unexpectedly. Fourth, V2G and smart charging programs assume bidirectional hardware in every model and universal access to dynamic pricing, features largely absent in most lower-cost EVs and utility territories. Finally, adding millions of EVs, even with demand response schemes, could still force utilities to invest in grid expansions and peaker plants in regions resistant to renewable builds, delaying true decarbonization. These factors suggest EV adoption risks, leaving vulnerable segments stranded or exposed.
While entry-level EVs may have slightly reduced range in extreme cold, manufacturers now equip even budget models with effective passive insulation and lower-cost thermal management systems that limit range loss to under 15%, which remains acceptable for most daily driving needs. On battery end-of-life, major automakers and recyclers have committed to scaling facilities to handle millions of packs. Policies like extended producer responsibility ensure manufacturers fund collection and recycling programs, preventing landfilled stockpiles. Regarding affordability, as residual values for used EVs stabilize and financing markets mature, interest rates and insurance premiums are steadily declining. Many insurers now offer discounts for EV safety ratings, and specialized lower-income financing products are emerging. V2G hardware is increasingly offered as an option, and one-way smart charging alone can stagger demand sufficiently to avoid new peaker plants. Most utilities already use managed charging to shave peaks. Finally, renewable builds paired with advanced forecasting and demand response eliminate the need for additional natural gas capacity in many regions, supporting a sustainable grid even under high EV adoption.
Even if recycling programs and financing improve, EV adoption still risks exacerbating socioeconomic and geographic inequities. First, charging infrastructure often follows affluent urban districts, leaving rural, low-income, and minority neighborhoods underserved. This charging desert dynamic means many potential buyers simply can't rely on convenient access. Second, public investment in EV incentives and grid upgrades often comes at the expense of other pressing infrastructure needs: roads, transit, and low-income housing, disproportionately benefiting wealthier EV purchasers. Third, automaker promises to cover recycling costs hinge on legislation that remains inconsistent globally. Without uniform extended producer responsibility laws, significant volumes of spent batteries could still end up in developing country landfills or informal recycling operations. Fourth, with critical minerals, lithium, nickel, graphite, concentrated in a handful of countries, sudden supply shocks or export restrictions could spike battery prices overnight and stall adoption, leaving owners with rapidly depreciating assets. Until these equity, policy, and supply chain vulnerabilities are transparently addressed, EVs risk deepening existing disparities rather than broadly delivering sustainable mobility.
While inequities exist, targeted policies and private partnerships are rapidly closing charging deserts. Federal and state grants now prioritize stations in rural and low-income areas, and community organizations deploy shared chargers in minority neighborhoods, ensuring broader access. Regarding funding trade-offs, EV incentives often leverage clean energy funds or carbon reduction fees rather than general revenue, minimizing cuts to roads or housing. Moreover, charging and grid upgrades create local construction jobs that benefit those same communities. On recycling, leading manufacturers are proactively establishing take-back programs in all major markets, often operating under voluntary international standards that exceed local regulations, so spent batteries rarely reach informal recyclers. Finally, supply chain risk is being mitigated by diversifying sources. new US and Australian lithium projects, domestic graphite processing, and battery chemistries that reduce dependence on single countries. Together, these measures ensure EVs advance equity and resilience while supporting sustainable mobility.
Even if EVs overcome many technical challenges, prioritizing them may distract from more effective, systemic solutions. First, shifting resources toward EV charging networks and subsidies diverts funding from public transit, bike lanes, and pedestrian infrastructure, which can reduce vehicle miles traveled far more efficiently than electrifying personal cars. Second, EVs remain heavier than equivalent gasoline vehicles, battery packs at several hundred pounds, accelerating road wear, increasing tire particulate emissions, and straining already underfunded infrastructure. Third, a substantial rebound effect looms. Lower fuel costs encourage longer commutes and more driving, potentially negating carbon savings. Fourth, emerging alternative technologies, green hydrogen for heavy-duty vehicles or synthetic e-fuels for legacy fleets, could deliver decarbonization without requiring complete fleet turnover or extensive grid upgrades. Finally, consumer adoption rates have plateaued in many regions, suggesting that without simultaneous investments in urban density and mobility demand management, EVs alone won't meaningfully reduce congestion or emissions at scale. In short, focusing predominantly on EVs risks overlooking broader, more equitable solutions to our transportation and climate challenges.
Investing in EV infrastructure need not cannibalize funding for public transit or active mobility projects. Many EV incentives are financed through dedicated clean energy or carbon reduction programs, while separate grants support bus rapid transit, bike lanes, and sidewalks. Regarding vehicle weight, modern EVs often match the curb weight of comparable SUVs, and regenerative braking reduces brake wear particulate matter. Tire emissions remain a concern across all vehicle types, and ongoing research is improving tire compounds to minimize particle release. While lower operating costs can encourage more driving, smart pricing schemes and managed charging discourage unnecessary trips. And even with modest increases in mileage, EVs still emit far less CO2 per mile than combustion vehicles. As for hydrogen and e-fuels, those technologies currently entail 5 to 6 times higher energy losses than battery electric powertrains and lack scaling infrastructure. So, hydrogen is best reserved for heavy-duty or industrial uses, while synthetic fuels remain niche. Finally, although adoption curves occasionally plateau, cumulative EV sales continue to climb globally. Pairing EV rollout with urban density and demand management policies will further reduce congestion and emissions, rather than letting any single solution bear the full burden.
Despite promising innovations, electric vehicles still confront significant hurdles that cannot be overlooked. Infrastructure gaps persist in many areas, and equity concerns risk leaving rural and low-income communities behind. Supply chain constraints and geopolitical risks may drive costs higher. Heavier EVs exacerbate road wear and particulate emissions, while subsidies divert resources from public transit and active mobility solutions that could yield greater emissions reductions. Until these systemic challenges are truly resolved, over-reliance on EVs risks sidelining more balanced, equitable pathways to cleaner transportation.
While EVs face challenges, they are integral to a multi-pronged decarbonization strategy. Public-private partnerships ensure charging equity in underserved regions, and batteries are becoming lighter and more sustainable. Investments in EVs complement, not replace, public transit and active mobility, creating a holistic transportation ecosystem. Financial mechanisms, such as targeted incentives and low-interest loans, mitigate cost barriers. Finally, as grids decarbonize and technology matures, EVs will continue to lower emissions at scale, ensuring they remain a cornerstone of future mobility.
In this debate, both sides scored high on their argumentation, with the EV skeptic side having a slight edge. Keep in mind that the content of this debate, and consequently the scores, depended on the initial prompt and the evaluation criteria. The goal was to see how two large language models debate with each other and in the process test the strengths and weaknesses of each position. Which side resonates with you? Share your perspective in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this debate as much as we did. Subscribe for more, and thanks for watching.